Alright, so this is the final project we're going to be doing in this course, and it's going to be more of a deep dive on texturing, because I feel like that's kind of the core of what you need to know in Octane, and we really haven't covered that quite enough, so let's jump in. This is just a small room scene that I put together, and I used the GSG Happy Model Toolbox Pack Volume 1 and 2. So you can get these at Grayscale Gorilla. There's tons of models in here, and they're all really cute and easy to work with. They're UV mapped and they're sub-D models, so definitely recommend these packs. The only model in here that's not from GSG is I've got my little dead mouse cart on the desk here. There he is. And I don't think I need to show you how I built this scene. I literally just move the models around until I like the placement, and there's really nothing complex going on here. It's just using your eye to make what you think is an attractive looking scene. Now, as far as building the room goes, let me show you a couple really easy techniques. So I am by no means a modeler or an ArcViz artist, but here's what I came up with. So let's start fresh with a new scene real quick. So for the floor, you drop in a plane, pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to hit C to make this editable, and I only wanted 3 walls, so I just double-clicked each of these edges to make a selection for the wall, and then I use the command edge to spline, and that'll create a spline from those edges right underneath your plane here. So we put this in an extrude, and then I can just zero this out and extrude upwards on the Y. So there are my walls, and then to make the ceiling, duplicate the plane. So that's real simple. Of course, you could also just drop in a cube, scale it out a little bit, hit C, delete this side, hit UL for loop selection, split that off with UP and delete, and then split one of these polygons off too. And there you go, that's the same thing, but that would just be way too easy because apparently I like to make things overly complicated. Now for the windows, I just placed them where I want them to go. So for instance, let's grab these two here and bring them into this project. And obviously our room is much smaller than it should be, but whatever. And let's say we want the windows to go somewhere around here. We'd probably want to scale them down a little bit first and then scoot them apart. So pretend that's what we want there. All I did to create holes for the windows is hit C to make this editable. This is the walls. And then I just pulled in a cube, scaled that down. Let's hit NF so we can see this more easily. And then I just scaled this out to about the same size as the windows. Something like that. And then I duplicated another one over here. And then I took these cubes, grouped them in a null, and then brought my wall up to the top here, and then grabbed both of these guys, and came over here and dropped in a bool, and then put the walls and this null into the bool object. And so if we turn off our windows here, you can see that that's made some holes. And the reason we want to do that is because we're going to make these windows glass so that we can actually see through them. Now the last little thing I modeled, and I'm putting that in air quotes, is the baseboard. So to do that, I started with the same spline as before, but it looks like I've deleted it, so let's just do it again. There's our edge, Shift-C, edge to spline. There's our spline. So that's going to be the path for our sweep, and now we just need the profile of our spline. So we can do that by coming into our right view, for instance, and just drawing some kind of curve. So let's come in here to something much smaller, and let's go boop. And like, that's pretty terrible. It can help to Google something like baseboard profiles. And then you'll get a whole bunch of ideas for different crazy baseboards you can make. I just went with something extremely simple like this, where it's got a curve, it juts out, and then it goes straight down. So mine's obviously super janky, but the easy way to fix that is just grab both of these points here, for instance, and then scale them down to 0 while holding down Shift. And then do the same thing for down here, scale to 0, and then up here. And then we could come in and modify this a little bit. So that's looking a little bit nicer. Maybe we bring this up. Close enough. Okay, and now let's take our profile spline down here, and then we'll drop it into a sweep. So let's just hold down Alt to get it to be the parent. And then we'll drop our other spline in here too. Now it's looking weird at first, so let's hit this solo button. And if you don't have Magic Solo, then you can come over to the solo mode here and go viewport solo single, and that'll work too. But I'm going to use my Magic Solo. So obviously something's not on the right axis. What we need to do is go to our profile here and rotate it 90 degrees. Now, just rotating it isn't going to do anything, but the second we select our axis here and rotate, then it's going to start to work. So let's go 90, holding down Shift, and there we go. That's getting closer. We need to flip it 180. And now we've got it. Let's unsolo. And now we're going to have to scoot it up. Get back out of our axis mode and scoot it up. And that should do it. If it's too big, we can scale down the profile spline and then scoot this whole setup back down. So there you go. A crappily modeled room. All right, so let's just jump in and start lighting and texturing. I'm going to start here with the windows and find a nice HDRI to go outside. So let's bring this up a little bit and fire off our render. And so we can actually see outside. Let's just drop in a specular material. And we can just drag this directly to the live viewer. Well, we would be able to if this subdivision surface were off. So say this were off, and then we dragged it in. Then it would go directly to the glass, but unfortunately because all of these are subdivision models, that's the first thing that Octane's going to see is this top object here if it's on. So rather than doing it that way, we can just come in and drop our glass directly onto this word glass here. And then I'll turn the subdivision for the window back on. All right, and let's move in a little bit. And let's drop in an HDRI. And here I'm going to use Grayscale Gorilla's HDRI link to make this a faster process. So I'll just come down here to HDRI link, and then I'll jump into my environment tag here, and then into the image texture. And from here, I'll just drag this file into this tag here. And then I can jump to my HDRI link tag and then launch the browser. And let's expand this a little bit. Let's just explore our options here. So I want this to be a nighttime scene. And something like this could work. So I'll drop that in as an option. A sunset vibe could work too, as long as it's dark enough in the room that we can light with area lights. We could also try out sidewalk at night. So this could be a really cool one as long as we've got some shallow depth of field going and we're not really seeing all this detail because it's a little distracting. Let's duplicate our HDRI one more time. And I think I was actually having some good luck within the trees here, because what we can do is we can just take the power down on this. But these are all options for later. Let's keep lighting and see what happens. So first off, I want to find everything in my scene that could be an emissive light and turn that on so that we can kind of get a sense of what the lighting in the room is going to look like. So let's back out here and maybe go for the lamp on this fan. When we click these objects at first that are under a subdivision surface, we get the whole object, and that's not what we want. So if we double click, we can actually get the individual object that we're looking for. Now I can hit scroll to first active, but I've also got a shortcut that's Alt S. So if I hit Alt S here, then it brings me down to the bulb. And let's just create a new diffuse material and then drop that on here. And then come to our node editor and then select here and go to emission, and let's choose a black body emission. So that's pretty good. I want it to be a warmer temperature, more of a tungsten light, so closer to maybe 2600. And then we can try really blasting this one, maybe take it to around 500 to light up the room a bit more. And we might take that down later if it's overpowering things and flattening out the lighting, but that's a good base to start from. Next, let's come over here to this lamp. And if we get a bit closer and then look under here, I'm just going to double click this bulb here. And then we'll duplicate this material so that we can change the power, but we can just drop this right on the bulb. And then we can come back up here and see how that's looking. Now, as usual, I'm in path tracing. If I were in direct lighting, this would look very different and not nearly as realistic. So path tracing, and I've got my GI clamp set to 1 like usual. Now this light is casting pretty nicely, but one thing I'm not liking is that we're not seeing through this lampshade at all, and so that doesn't feel very realistic to me. So if we right click and say select object, then we can find our shade here, and then let's just drop in another diffuse material, and let's double click this, and then we can come to the transmission channel and take this up to white. And so let's go compare store render buffer. So this is pretty good. We're getting a little bit of light coming through, but we're not getting any kind of gradient across this surface. So instead of a diffuse material, let's try a specular material. And obviously that's going to make it look like glass at first, so we need to take the roughness all the way up. And that's already doing a little bit better. The transmission's already at white, but here's another thing we can do. If we come down to common, we can tick this box called fake shadows. And now we're really seeing this come through here. So fake shadows is often a really good option for brightening your specular materials and allowing much more light to come through them. But if we look here, we can see we've kind of lost this nice casting pattern, so there might be a way to split this difference. So let's come back to this material. And instead of a specular material, let's switch it up to a universal. Now, as you remember, the first thing we need to do with universal is take the metallic slider all the way down. And now we're getting something maybe even nicer where we're seeing more of a gradient inside of this because we've reintroduced that albedo or diffuse component. Without this, if we're back down to black, the whole thing is just going to light up. And part of that might just be due to exposure. So if we turn on the camera imager and bring this down, you might start to see a bit more of a gradient, but really this is pretty uniform. All right, so let's just undo back here to when we had this nicer look going. Now keep in mind though, with the albedo, the default is 0.9 across the board. If this were all the way up at white, then it would totally block this out and the transmission wouldn't come through anymore. So let's take this back to 0.9. And now let's store our render buffer yet again. And then another thing we can try is if we come back to our transmission and maybe we only use this at half strength, so let's go 50%, but then we boost the light a ton. Let's come down here to our bulb, double click this, and then come up to the emission, and maybe we boost this up to 1500. And then the other thing we can do is go back to our shade material here, and then take the roughness back down. So there's a lot of different factors that we can play with. So I think this is a bit too bright and we went too far, so let's come back to the transmission and maybe boost this up a little bit. Maybe a little less. And then we can bring that light back down. Let's try 1000. So that's kind of a nice balance between seeing the bulb in here and then seeing these patterns on the wall. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with this shade and get back to you. Okay, so I just copied the materials over and that's the result. I think this room is getting a bit too warm, so let's just drop in a cooler area light somewhere. So here's my area light, and I think it could be cool to take this up here and behind the monitor and then spin it around 180. And then let's find the area light with Alt S and take this down to 0 opacity. And then maybe we scale this light down a bit. And I think the power is a bit too much. So somewhere around 25 could be cool. All right, next I'm just going to add a bit of contrast to this scene in my camera imager. So let's come in here, turn this on, and I'll take the gamma down so we're getting a bit more deep shadows. And maybe I'll bring the exposure up a little bit. And then I always like to put on my saturate to white so that these areas here that are burned out look white. And then maybe pull up the highlight compression a little bit, not too much. Also remember the lighting interacts with the materials, so once we add good looking materials, the lighting will change a lot and we'll have to tweak those two kind of in relationship to one another. All right, next we can come over here to this neon sign and maybe make this light up. So let's just drop in another black body emission material. So let's just find this object here. We could also come up to the viewport, double click. I'm gonna hit scroll to first active again, or Alt S for me. And here we want the neon material on everything but the back plates. So let's grab this and just drop it onto all the different letters. Okay, and we can start to name these. I'm pretty bad about this, but let's call this one neon. And this one's lampshade. Bulb. This is our window material. This is our lampshade. And let's just pull out here a little bit. If I right click and select this material, I misnamed this. This is actually our fan bulb. And then let's come over here. Right click, select material. I see what's going on. We never actually duplicated our bulb material. So let's just call this lamp bulb. Bring this over here. And then duplicate this. And then this one will be our neon material. And it looks like this one and this one aren't assigned to anything, so we can just go ahead and delete those. So let's come back to our neon material here. And we also have to reapply it to the sign because currently it's just sharing the lamp bulb material. So a good way to do this all at once is we can select all of these and then come up here and just replace it up here. Now let's come back into our Octane node editor. And here, let's take the temperature back to 6500, which is the default neutral white. And then we can take this power further down. And from here, we can add in an RGB spectrum into the texture. And then we could just select a color. I'm going to go for like a greenish. And then we'll have to pull this further down. And actually, I think I'm going to go for an even more saturated color here and just a little bit more towards blue. Now, don't ask me why this kid has an open sign in his room or an arcade machine. I guess he's just cool like that. And normally the better way to do neon would be if you had a sweep that's slightly larger, that's the glass tube, and then you'd see more of that outer glass look with the white hot center. But in this case, it's fine because we're not going to be close up on the open sign. All right, so last but not least, I'm going to come over here to this desk lamp, and then we'll add in a bulb texture. So let's duplicate our lamp bulb here, and then double click this guy here, Alt S, drop it onto the bulb, and I'm not seeing anything happen, so let's refresh. There we go. And let's see if it's too bright. Definitely looking a little bit too powerful, so let's jump in here and take this way down to maybe 100 or 200. Now here we're seeing something interesting. Currently it's taking a long time for this light to resolve. You can see that it's still pretty grainy even after 500 samples. So to counteract that, I'm going to come up to our sampling rate here in this specific light, and I'm going to boost this up to maybe 5. And now this is cleaning up a lot faster. If I boosted this to say, I don't know, 111, this would clean up super fast, but now you're going to see that the other lights in the scene are taking a really long time to resolve. So these light samples are kind of a balancing act. And the balance is between everything that emits light in the scene. So you have to consider all of your area lights and your emissive textures, and sometimes your daylight if that's in there too. So I'm going to take this back down to 5 because I think that balanced everything out a little bit more nicely. And now let's jump back and look at our overall scene. So right now the lighting is way too warm. And what we can do to counterbalance against that is just come into our Octane tag here and take our white point a little bit towards orange. Maybe even more. And now that's neutralizing things a lot more. I'd also like to get a LUT going on, so let's drop down to our custom LUT. And then I'm going to go for my usual Vision 6 here. And immediately I like those colors way better, though I'm going to take it somewhat down from the full strength because this orange is getting really, really saturated. So let's take this down to maybe like, I don't know, 0.5 or 0.6. I'm also liking this cyan a bit better than the green that we had before. Now these glowing lights here that are white hot should have a bit more bloom around them, so let's come to our post-processing and enable that, and then just bring up our bloom power a little bit. Okay, and now we can start actually texturing this scene. So a fun one to start with that's going to make a big difference would be this floor. So I'm going to go to my trusty CCO textures here. And then I'm going to search for wood floor. And I'm just going to control click on anything that I see that looks good. Alright, so we got these kind of planks here. I'm not loving this one. This is alright, but I'm seeing a lot of texture repetitions. I really like this look here. So I'm going to download this as JPEG 8K. And real quick, I'd also like to point out that this got a lot more blue in the background, so it's more convincingly like approaching dusk or nighttime because we shifted the whole color balance towards orange. And one other thing we could do here is if we wanted this to be a bit more moody, we could go back up to our environment tag here and then click the node editor and then just drop a color correction in here. And I want to shift this a little bit more cyan. Other way. So maybe something like that could be cool. All right, now let's get to this floor. Let's pan downwards so we can see it a bit better. And I'll come over to my materials panel, drop in a new glossy material here, and then drop it on. We got a shiny floor. Let's come into our node editor here and then get active material. And then let's come up to our image texture and drop one in the diffuse. And then let's grab from my downloads folder, because I'm lazy right now, these planks, I've got to extract them. There we go. Let's grab the color first. And these boards are obviously way too big, so let's go UV transform and scale them on down. Maybe around this scale is pretty good, so let's duplicate this and then link our transform back up. And now let's come over to our roughness map here and just drop that straight in. Now we're getting much nicer breakup here of the reflections. And finally, let's grab our normal map. And pipe this into our normal slot. And now we're really seeing these floorboards come out a lot. And if we want a bit of a shinier floor, we could let the normal map do most of the work. So say we disconnected the roughness map here. Now the issue here is that it's both shiny and bumpy, so it's going to take a lot longer to resolve. You can tell that this is pretty grainy looking. But if we just bring up the roughness a bit from 0, it's going to resolve a lot more quickly. So let's compare this look to when we actually use the roughness map. And I think I'm actually liking the shinier floor a little bit better. So maybe we ditch the roughness map on this one. But we could maybe bring this up a little bit so that we're getting a nice sheen here, but nothing too crazy. Okay, I think that's good for the floor. Let's come up here to the window again. And let's get this looking foggy, and maybe we're gonna pretend that it's a dark and stormy night out there and this guy's just hunkered down and working on his GSG training. So let's right click and select this material. And let's start by dropping an image texture into the roughness here. All right, now first off, I'm gonna load up one of my favorite textures here, which is this Glass Dirt 3. I'm not actually sure where I got this, but you could easily make something similar by overlaying a few grunge textures together and then making sure that the center is more blown out white compared to the edges. So this creates the effect of grunge on the edges of the window pane. So let's load that up here. And I'm gonna right click and solo this. Now this is an issue with specular materials in Octane and soloing that I'm trying to get them to fix, but soloing sadly doesn't work under this specular type. So let's switch this to diffuse and then we'll see what's going on. And let's click this and UV transform. Let's scale this on down. And then we can just transform it on the X, somewhere around there. And maybe let's stretch it out a little bit and then bring it down again. There we go, so I think that works pretty well. Let's disable the solo. And then remember to come back here and change it back to specular. And right now this is the inverse of what we want, so we could just come here and invert it. And there we go. Now we have this foggy glass. And I think we could crunch it down a bit more because we're not seeing very much out here at all. So let's just drop in a gradient. And let's bring our black point a little bit down. Maybe even more, so it's just on the edges. But then maybe we keep a little bit of roughness here so we're not fully seeing out the window. So we can double click this black point and bring it up just a bit. And so now we've got a pretty dirty looking window. Maybe it's a little bit too rough, so we could take this down a bit too. And that's just a little bit more subtle. Cool, so next let's get those raindrops on here. We can drop in another image texture here, and this time we're gonna put it in the bump. Now I'm going to use this free texture from Cornelius Domrich. If you go to zomax.net and then come over to tutorials, scroll down here, we've got some 8K tileable glossy maps that are really cool, but we also have this 8K raindrop displacement map. So just click here to download it. You can also get some really nice textures and grunge maps like this from polygon.com. So if you come to textures and then search for rain, we've got a bunch of different nice looks here. Same thing goes for grunge, or maybe imperfection. If you type in surface imperfections, this gets you some really nice stuff. There's also sites like surfaceimperfections.com, which is a library here of surface imperfection maps. And then there's also this awesome realistic animated raindrop material from Travis Davids, as well as 50 tileable roughness maps, displacement maps, and all sorts of stuff from him. And then the French Monkey also has a really good grunge pack. So lots of options here. So back to this, I'm going to import my free raindrop map. And though it's a displacement map, I can also use it as a bump map. You can see it's starting to work already. Let's transform this. And I think the UVs on this window are a little bit weird, so we have to rotate this 90 degrees. And then let's scale it down. So that's already looking pretty convincing. Though actually the drops might be a little bit too big right now, so let's scale this down even more. There we go, I think I like that a bit better. Okay, so for this frame, I'm thinking we do a bit of a chipped wood type look. So we can come back to our CCO textures, and here is this one called Wood 34. So I'm going to use this as my base and download the 8K JPEG. Now just a quick note, don't do what I do and leave your textures in the downloads folder. You should be organizing them into your project folder, and if you don't, there's a good chance you'll delete them out of your downloads folder, and then they'll get disconnected from your project. So at the very least, once you finish your day's work, you should go to File and then Save Project with Assets, and this will collect all of the textures and things in your project file into a single folder. So that's a lot safer. Anyway, let's come back to materials here and create a new glossy material. And I'll drop this on this window frame. And let's right click and select object. And rather than on this top hierarchy here, I'll drop it on the window inset and these screens and the frame. So now let's come into our node editor here, and I'll drop in an image texture into the diffuse. And now let's grab our wood color here. And I'm going to desaturate this because I wanted it to be a white wood. So let's come in here to our color correction and just desaturate. And maybe we can mess with the gamma so it's not so dark. Let's solo this to see what's going on. So we can see some small bit of detail, but I've pushed it too hard. That might be good right there. Let's scale this down a bit. And then let's disable solo. Now let's also drop in a gradient and maybe solo this again and crunch this down so that we're seeing some of that wood pattern come through, but we're trying to keep it pretty bright. And maybe here we can use the gamma as well. Something like that might work. Let's give it a bit of roughness. And actually we can pop in our roughness map here. But let's make sure to share this transform node. And then let's not forget the normal map, so we'll duplicate this as well. Transform node. And let's grab the normal map and put this in the normal slot. So that's looking pretty nice. I think maybe we can take this black up as well so that we're just getting a bit of that wood texture, but we're keeping it as white as possible. Okay, let's pan the camera a little bit. This is just bugging me. So we can see this just a bit better, frame up on it. Now actually let's switch gears here and try to make something like this, where overall we've got a white coat of paint on the frame, but it's chipped and showing through to a bit of a darker wood. So this could be our base texture here, though in this case I think we would actually want to darken this down to something more like this. Now here's where it would be good to show you how to do a mix or a composite material. So we've already got this material, and what if we create another one that's a glossy material here, and we'll just leave this white with a little bit of roughness. And then we also create a mix material. So this mix material can be a mix between our wood and our white paint. And now we're going to want to replace this. So if we scroll down, let's just grab these 4 here and replace it with our mix. And then we'll select this and come into our node editor and hit Get Active Material. Now let's try to fix this up a little bit. We can kind of drag these apart. If something's really messy, you can right click and select Hierarchy and then move everything downstream of that at once. So I could select this gradient and then select Hierarchy, and it would just take everything behind it. So right now what's happening is we've got a mix between material 1 and 2, material 1 being our wood and material 2 being our glossy white paint. And here we've got a float texture, which is just a value between 0 and 1 that's driving our amount. So at 0, we're going to have this clean white paint, and at 1, we're going to have our darker wood. Now I think we can make this an even bigger contrast. Right now they're not looking different enough, so let's take this wood and make it a little bit darker. So we'll bring this back down to black, and that should be more obvious. So instead of driving this with a float texture, we could drive it with anything. Let's grab an image texture, for instance, and let's go back to Polygon and search for chipped. And something like this could work all in and of itself, but we wouldn't be able to create dirt mats for the edges of materials and other procedural techniques that I'll show you in a second. But at the very least, we could try using this to drive that difference between our 2 materials. And actually, after looking back, this chip paint 18 is pretty sweet too. So especially this gloss here. Let's download this. All right, let's navigate to that. Chip paint 18. And I'm going to grab the gloss. Now let's solo this and just scale this down. It's actually easier to see out of solo mode here. And maybe I went a bit too far with the scale, so let's go to something like 0.6. And here the other thing we can do is we can make this contrast a bit more extreme by putting in a gradient. And we'll just crunch this down a little bit. And this is really bringing out that edge between our wood here and the white paint. Now one thing I'm not loving is the lighting here. So if we drop in an area light, and then let's come over to options and untick check camera and jump back here. And then we'll bring this light closer to the wall. And rotate it around. Let's make sure to make it invisible and scale it down. And we'll also take the power down. Okay, I've added a bit of a cool light here and a warm light here. I'm not necessarily going to leave these for the final, but at least it's allowing us to see this texture a little bit better. So let's come back to our viewpoint here and go back and turn on check camera. Okay, I definitely still think this underlying wood material could be a bit darker. So let's come here to our gradient and just take this down a bit. That's maybe a little bit too far. Okay, let's set this aside as an option. And then let's look at this dirt node here. So this node is like a curvature map or an ambient occlusion where it can read the geometry and find the edges or the crevices of your model and then procedurally generate bright or dark areas based on that. So if we pipe this into our amount here and solo this, let's bring this over. We can boost the strength, and now we're seeing white on the edges here. And we can also boost the radius, say we bring it up to 15. Now you can see this is happening in the crevices. If we invert the normal here, this will be happening on the edges. Now 15 is way too much. Let's take it up to like 4. And now if I unsolo this, we can see that we've got the white paint on the edges and the wood in the core here. Now we want the opposite of this, and inverting the normal doesn't do it because that just swaps between the crevices here and the edges. One way to do it would be flipping around these 2 nodes for these materials, but an easier way would just be grabbing an invert node and popping it right here. Cool, so now we've got our wood material on the edges and our white paint on the center here, but we're not really getting any breakup of the edges. But that's where we can bring in this texture here and maybe multiply these 2 together. So if we grab a multiply node and just drop these 2 together, you'll see that this texture is actually breaking up our dirt node here. If we solo this, we can see what's going on. Now let's disable this solo, and maybe even better than a multiply, if I delete that, would be a mix. So let's put this in here. And this is very similar to our mixed material, except that rather than mixing between two different materials, it's mixing between two different textures using an amount. So let's take this as texture 2, and this one is texture 1, and then let's put this back into our amount slot here. So now if we blend all the way to 0, we'll be back to just our dirt shader. And if we blend back to 1, then we'll be back to our chips. So now we could use maybe a noise texture here to drive the differences between these two. And here if we solo this, sometimes we'll get this view and other times we'll get the actual noise. It's a little bit buggy, but let's boost the contrast here. And it's not really showing me this difference in solo mode, so let's disable it. So unfortunately this is really buggy and difficult to see. So what we can do is we can just disconnect this here. And we can bring it all the way back to our white paint material and just pop it into the diffuse slot. And then we can disconnect this amount here and make sure that we're resting fully on the white paint material, which would be 0. So now we're actually seeing this noise here. And when I make changes, it'll update, including when I solo it. So here we can just design our noise and then plug it back into our scenario up there. So let's boost the contrast all the way up, and we can even go past 100. We can go all the way up to 1000, and this will give us a very patchy result where in certain areas we're seeing that worn away edge material, and in other areas we're seeing our chipped paint. And if we want, we could even combine this with another noise where this is our big scale noise, and we also have a smaller scale noise, so we can multiply this together with another noise. And then solo this guy. And this one we would just add a UV transform and grab our transform over here. And this one we would just scale down. And here I don't like that we're not getting pure black in these areas, so what I can do is we can pop in a gradient, solo this, and then just crunch this down. So now we've got a bunch of areas of pure black with some smaller breakup. So let's take this whole setup here and disconnect it and then move it back up here. And then let's reconnect our amount and then bring this back down a little bit and plug this into our amount here. And now let's disable our solo node. And this is looking a lot more realistic because here we're getting a few areas of breakup that are showing back to that wood texture rather than across the entire surface of the frame. The only thing I'm not liking now is that in the sections where we just see our dirt node, we're getting these cleaner lines. So we need to break this up too. All right, so let's solo this dirt node. Now we just want to break this up. So wherever this appears, it'll also be broken up. So we have to do a really similar thing with a noise texture, or it could be an image texture. But basically we want to add in another mix node here. And we want this to actually be in texture slot 1. So if this is white on the dirt, then we want texture 2 to be pure black. So let's just grab a float. And let's set this to 0. And now if we solo this and start mixing between 0 and 1, and then let's disable and re-enable so that we can actually see what's going on. There we go. Now we're seeing black. So at 0 we're seeing white, and at 1, and again I'm getting lots of bugs with the solo not updating, but I know that on 0 here we're going to be piped to texture 1, and at 1 we're going to be at texture 2, which is simply black. And finally, to modulate between those two, let's grab another noise and pipe that into the amount. And this time we don't need to create some kind of complex noise. Let's keep it simple, and we'll just drive up the contrast to 1000. We can also boost the octaves and the omega so that we get more detail. And let's disable this and then solo it again. And finally, Octane is letting us see our soloed result. So maybe this needs to be a little bit bigger of a noise. So let's UV transform, and then we'll scale it up. Just as a side note, there's a little disable node button here on every node. So that can be a little helpful when you're trying to jog these into working. But when all else fails, let's just re-render. And then let's solo this yet again. There we go, now we're seeing bigger breakup. So let's disable this solo and see what we can see. So now when we see these lines of our dirt node, they're a little bit more broken up. We could maybe enhance this by increasing the radius of our dirt. So let's bump this up to something like 7. And now we're able to see more of the texture of these areas, and you can see these chunks taken out here. And maybe let's mess with the transform of this dirt node a little bit more. And we can pop a render region here just to see what's going on a little bit faster. That's looking pretty good to me. This is really broken up now. So you can see how these node trees can get pretty complex, but in the end, it's a lot of small steps that add up to something that looks a lot more complicated than it is. And it can really be worth the end result to put time into these materials. So if I were to summarize this material, I would say that this whole tree, if I grab my hierarchy here and bring it up, this whole thing is a big mask that modulates between our wood and our paint. And now internally within this mask, we've got it further split out between this tree here, if I select this hierarchy, which is our dirt edges. So again, if we were to disconnect this and just drag this to 0, we would see only our dirt edges, which we've then broken up with this noise. So there's all our dirt edges, and this is a cool look in and of itself. And then at 1, we're on this pathway here, which is just this chips texture here. And right now that's causing the whole mask. So then we're further taking this whole setup, which is this big noise and then this small noise, multiplied together and crunched down in the gradient, to choose between areas where we see one of those setups and then the other setup. So altogether that creates a lot of randomness, which contributes to the realism, as does the fact that we've got more damage on the edges here, which tends to make it more believable because that's where objects typically get scuffed up. Now, as a quick aside, these mixed materials can get kind of cumbersome, and they're not the newest way to do this. The reason that they can get irritating is because it's actually 3 materials that you have to manage, and if you're copying things over to another scene, it can get kind of clunky. Now the cool thing is there's this slightly newer material here called the composite material, though it used to be called blend and the icon is still blend. And if you drop that in and we go into our node editor here, you can see that it's got a different setup, but we can go add material here and then add material here. And then we could actually add a third material here as well if we wanted to. So we can do as many materials mixed together as we want. And the way you can control that is by going back to this composite material here and then upping the number of materials. So you can do as many as you want, up to 12 I think, though I don't know why you would ever need that many. And here instead of amount, the terminology is now mask, which makes a lot more sense. Now if we grab both our mixed material and our new composite material and then open the node editor, we can see both at once. I can come here and I can select hierarchy to separate these. So here's the composite and here's our big old mix. The irritating thing is I can't take this glossy material, for instance, remember this is our white paint, and use it here instead. So these are special submaterials, and in order to convert them over, we would have to match the settings between them. But we could grab all these textures here and pipe them into the same slots here. So it is possible to convert them over, it's just a bit of a headache. And just another note here, I'm always learning, and I learned something new today. So if you right click a standard material, you can actually convert it to a submaterial. And this will actually set up a composite material for you. So I take back all this complaining I just did, because it's actually a pretty simple process to convert a regular material into a composite material. The nice thing though is once you have a composite material fully set up, it's fully self-contained, and you only have to deal with one material out here in this view. So I'm just going to delete that because it's not really affecting us right now, but just for future use it's really good to know. Alright, that was a tough one, so next let's choose something a lot easier. Let's just navigate over here to the wall, and let's get a nice funky wallpaper going. So I'm going to jump to polygon.com, and I'm going to search for wallpaper. And I'm really digging this pattern with the birds, so let's download this. Okay, and I'll drop in a new glossy material, and let's just drop that on the wall here. And then we'll come into our node editor, hit get active material, and then drop an image texture into the diffuse, and then let's grab that pattern. Variation 1 is the one we want. And then let's UV transform and scale this down. And there's an obvious issue here in that this background is black when it used to be white. So I think that's due to the alpha channel. And I don't think there's a way to ditch the alpha channel here in Octane. You can come over here to the type and select alpha, which will actually show us that there is an alpha channel that's being used, but there's no option, unfortunately, to lose it. So in After Effects, I'm just going to import this one texture, and then we'll drop it into a new comp. And then I'll just create a white background. All right, and then I'll save this just as a JPEG back into the same folder and just save it out. Okay, and let's replace this. And there we go, that's already looking better. Now obviously it's squished, so let's go to transform here, unlock the ratio, and then unsquish it. And we also need to flip it 180. There we go, much nicer. I think I stretched it out a bit too much, so let's bring it back. And let's lock the aspect ratio yet again, and then maybe scale the whole thing down a touch. Maybe that's a bit too far. And maybe let's scoot it over slightly. I like that these aren't intersecting with the window quite as much. Now obviously we need to add some roughness, but one other thing we could do is add a normal map. So I'm going to come back to polygon, and I'm going to search for plaster. And so there are a lot of options here, but something like this could work great. So I'm just going to download this, and then I'll duplicate up my texture. We don't need to worry about sharing the transform node because this is a totally different texture. So let's grab our normal map here, and I'll pipe that into the normal slot. And you can see this is adding some texture to the wall. It's probably too much right now and it's too shiny, so let's maybe grab the gloss map as well. Let's duplicate this, and here we can share the transform, and this one can come up here, and I'll scoot this over. And then grab the gloss map. And remember, this is a glossy map, so we need to invert it, which converts it to a roughness map. And maybe this is actually too much because now I'm not seeing much of that texture at all. So let's lose this and then just manually drag the roughness up a bit to spread this specular highlight out some. Now remember, this light is not necessarily one we're going to keep, but we know that if lights are hitting the wall, we're going to get some nice little added detail. And in fact, this light is a little bit distracting, so let's kill it. So it's subtle, but if we're close up on this wall, we're definitely going to see some of these little added details. All right, next let's get this screen dialed in. So let's create a new glossy material, and then I'll right click and select object, Alt S to jump to the TV. And this is actually a TV model, though I put a keyboard in front of it so it could look more like a computer. Let's drop this on the LCD here, and now let's get active material. And this is going to be an emissive material, so I'm going to just go take a picture of GSG's site. I'm on PC, so I'm going to hit Shift Windows S, and then I'll just take a picture from here down to here. And let's close that. And there's maybe an easier way to do this, but I'm going to go to Paint and Paste and then Save. Okay, let's come over here, and we're going to start actually with the diffuse material so that we can get that emission going. And let's test the difference between black body and texture emission. So let's start with black body. And let's grab an image texture here. And then I'll come to my downloads and find my GSG still. Now this is obviously way too bright. Bring this down until we actually see the image. And then let's transform this around so that it fits the screen. Unlock the aspect ratio. And scoot it around. Stretch it out a bit more. Let's just get that Grayscale Gorilla banner up there. This white bar is really distracting, so let's actually just scale this up. Something like that, and then scoot it down. There we go, I think that's pretty close. Now it's really washed out, so let's take the diffuse down to black. And that's much closer, but now let's see the difference between this black body emission and the texture emission. So let's go compare store render buffer, and let's grab a texture emission and pull this in here and pipe this over to the emission. And obviously we need to bring this back down as well. Let's get them to be the same exact brightness. So there's a slight difference, and I think texture emission is better for textures, as the name would suggest, because it preserves a little bit more detail. You can see here with this button, Learn Now, it's getting fully blown out with the black body emission. So it just kind of gives you a bit more dynamic range. Now we've got another issue here in that this looks good, but it doesn't look realistic. It looks like we've just stamped this on here. And that's because we've got a diffuse material, and usually computer screens are a bit glossy, or at least we see some surface imperfections. But if we change this from a diffuse material to a glossy, then we're going to lose the texture. So let's go universal, and then take our metallic slider all the way down. And now we're starting to pick up some reflections. Let's drop in a roughness map. So image texture into the roughness. I'm going to use this fingerprints overlay here. And you can get one like this from zomax.net as well. So if you come over again to tutorials, and then under this 8K glossy tileable maps, here's the fingerprint one. So let's solo this. Fingerprints are way too big. UV transform. Scale it on down. Disable. And now we're still not picking up a ton here, so let's disconnect the emission so we can see what's going on. And I think that this texture just needs a little bit more contrast. So let's drop in a gradient. And let's make sure the blacks are a little bit crunched. And let's solo this. And let's push this even further. And then maybe take the whites down somewhat. And now let's push in on this so we can see the texture a bit better. So now I'm seeing the reflections in here, though I'm not necessarily reading these fingerprints as much. Maybe if we solo this again, bring that up a little bit. Let's crunch this in even more. I think that's about as close as it's going to get, and now the grunge is maybe even too crunchy, but let's bring back the emission to see what happens. And this still isn't showing up as much as I'd like, so I'm going to switch gears, and I've got yet another pack here from 3D Collective that I'm going to use. So I'm going to jump over here and grab another texture. Now this is kind of a good smeared fingerprint look. Let's try that. And again, let's disconnect this emission, and let's solo this. Let's bring this back and down to black, and then this one all the way up to white. And maybe let's scale this down a bit. Okay, that's looking pretty gross and good. Let's use an add node here and combine it with another map. So we'll just grab all this, and then if I hold down Alt, I can just drop this between these. And then I'll duplicate this guy here. And these little dusts and hairs could work pretty well. So let's pop that in here. And we can solo this. And maybe scale this down. There we go. And then one other thing we could do to really boost this reflection would be to come over to IOR, and we could kind of artificially boost this. Maybe it's 1.5 or even an index of 2. And now our reflections are going to show up a lot more. And I do want some of these areas to be fully shiny. So let's bring this over and then drop in yet another gradient and then crunch the blacks a little bit. And solo this. And now let's disable this solo and pop our texture emission back in. And actually I lied about crunching this in, because when I go all the way to the left, this breakup starts to get a lot more obvious. And if I had a light blasting this, for instance, we would really see this stuff. So it is definitely working. It's just a little bit subtle. And last comment real quick, I lied earlier when I said that the black body emission node didn't have the same dynamic range. If we look here, they're basically the same. The one reason to use texture emission is that it's not adding any color by default. Black body emission, on the other hand, has this Kelvin scale of temperature and tints this a bit more blue right out of the gate. Of course, you could compensate for that, so either way, it's not really that big a difference. And actually, I'm liking this warmer tint to the screen better anyway, so I'm going to leave the black body emission. We could even maybe boost this up a little bit so that the whites are a bit whiter. Okay, I missed this window, so I'm going to reapply that texture. Let's right click and select this object. And then I can select all these, right click and say apply. Cool, so that's working. Now let's go for this desk. Here, I'm going to reuse this wood material, so I'll drag this out, come into my node editor here, get active material, and I'll just delete the color correction and gradient that are causing it to be tinted, and then we'll drag this over to the diffuse. So let's drop this wood material down on this desk. And here we don't want to apply it to the whole desk, so let's just do the top desk. And let's get a render region out and kind of come around here a little bit. So I think the texture is a little bit too big, so we can come and transform this down a bit. And for me it's a little bit too peachy, so let's get a color correction in here. And maybe shift the hue a little bit. And we could play with the gamma to make it a bit darker, but that correction is also going to saturate it, so let's take the saturation down a touch, and then the hue even further over. Now it's kind of hard to get a good sense of the desk from here because there's this green light that's casting from our neon sign, so maybe we'll swing around here. Let's ditch the roughness map. And this is looking pretty nice, but I think the normal map could come down and we could have some little surface imperfections instead. So let's take this down. And then instead of this roughness map, let's find something else. I'm going to grab this same fingerprints texture again, and I'll put this into the roughness, and I'll solo it. Definitely disconnect this transform, add a new one, and scale it down. So if I come around here, I'm definitely noticing these imperfections on the desk. Maybe fingerprints isn't the way to go on this. I've got a couple more from the 3D Collective that might be good. So this one's a bunch of scratches, and this one's more like smudges. So let's start with this one, and again let's solo this, and scale it down a bit. And then same deal as before, let's drop in an add node, duplicate this, and grab our scratches map. And then I'll solo these together. And I can see the scratches a little bit, but they're kind of faint. So let's maybe play with the power. Let's boost this up to like 5. And there, now I'm seeing a bunch more scratches. So let's disable this. And that's looking pretty nice and realistic to me. If we want to go overboard, we could even use this as a bump map, though we would have to dial it way down. So let's go all the way down here and then pop it into the bump. So let's compare and store that. And then without the bump, you can see it's definitely carving these grooves into the wood a lot more. But if this were at full power, it would just overwhelm the whole table. So let's take this down quite a bit. I think that level's pretty good. Alright, and we can reuse this wood for the rest of the desk, but let's make it more of a white wood. So we'll duplicate this, and then we'll drop it onto the left and right drawers. And actually we can right click and say copy tag to children, and same thing here. And then we can also get rid of this here. The only thing I don't want it on is the handles. So let's delete these from the handles. There should be 4. And let's actually just give the handles some new texture. I'll drop in a metallic material here and apply it. So that's nice and shiny, though maybe it's a bit too shiny. Let's come to our Octane node editor, get active material. And actually, rather than metallic, which I find hard to control the index of refraction, I'm going to switch it back to glossy, but then take our index up to maybe 8. And you can see even an index of 8 is not as shiny as we just had with the metallic material. The metallic material by default is more like an index of 1 in the glossy setup. So I'll take it back to 8. And then again, we want our surface imperfections, so let's drop in a texture to the roughness, And now I've got another set of fingerprints from 3D Collective that are a bit more defined. And you can find stuff like this all over the place. Like Polygon has a bunch of maps like this too. Let's zoom into this. Right click in Solo. This definitely needs a gradient. And solo the gradient and pull this downwards until it's really boosted. And this also needs to be scaled down. There we go, now we're seeing individual fingerprints. Let's disable the solo. And so that this is really shiny in certain areas, let's crunch this in a bit. Solo it again. Too far. And maybe let's shift it around so that we get something a bit more interesting. That could be cool. Now I'm seeing some nice breakup here, but also some shiny sections. And back to this wood, let's right click and select material. This one mostly just needs to desaturate. I think that's working nicely, though I doubt this one needs all those surface imperfections because it's not the top of the desk. So let's lose these. So that's pretty cool right there. All right, next we can go for this chair. I think this part could be metal too, so we could just reuse this. Let's right click and select this object, and then come down to the arms and apply this. I'm going to temporarily turn off the subdivision surface so that I can quickly grab this. And this is part of the base, so maybe we copy this to the base. And obviously that's put the metal all over the place, but we can see our surface imperfections at work here. But the reason is that we don't have any materials on the setting or the cushion. So for now, let's just drop in a diffuse material here. And there we go, that's looking a lot better. Let's come down. And here for these legs, I think we could also use the same metal material. So I'll double click this and put this on this wheels object. But for the actual wheels, maybe we use like a black plastic. So let's drop in a new glossy material and then just drop this onto each individual wheel. Okay, and then let's just take our diffuse down to black. Come into our node editor. And same deal as usual, image texture into the roughness is the way to go. And maybe this time I'll actually use this fingerprints texture. Let's solo this and scale it up. Something like that. Let's disable it. And that should be just fine. All right, looking good. While we're here, I think we could apply that same texture to our lamp. So let's jump over here. Drop that right here. Boom, instant shiny. Okay, this desk is feeling too gray to me and drab, so let's right click, select material, go to our node editor, get active material. And in our gamma, let's play with this. There we go, that's much nicer looking. And that may have just wiped out our diffuse, but that's okay because the normal map still carries all of those little indents and things that make it feel like wood. And we can also lose the bump map on this because we don't need a ton of scratches here. All right, somehow this is no longer emitting light, so let's fix this. Double click this guy here. Get active material. Oh, there it goes. Don't know why it decided to turn itself off, but hey. Now if we wanted to do this ultra correct, we would actually put the emissive material on the filament, and then we would put a glass material on the bulb. If we dim this down, you can see what's going on. Now it's just emitting from the filament, though the bulb probably would have a bit of roughness. And now we would probably want to blast this again. But if you notice, this really doesn't feel like it's affecting the desk anymore. So to fix that, we would need to come to the glass here and then turn on fake shadows. And now it's coming through again. That same thing would be true if we had the outer glass shell of the neon. But I'm going to undo because all that's pretty unnecessary. And I like the light better when it was just coming from the bulb. Since we're staring at him, let's do this little bob-omb. And reference is always good. So it looks like he's got very orange plasticky feet, and then more of a metallic gold wind-up toy handle. So orange plastic, let's put it on the feet here. Though, again, that just applies to the top. So let's drop this down and grab the feet. Get our active material. And then change our diffuse to an orange. Maybe a little bit of roughness. Seems pretty good to me. We could add some surface imperfections, but it's so small that I don't think we're going to notice. So let's just duplicate this for the main body. All right, and let's just shift this to blue. A little bit more blue. Darker blue. Less saturated. And he's got a bit of a bump map, so let's just grab a noise here and then use this in the bump. And we'll solo this just to see what it's doing. UV transform. Scale it down a little bit and up the contrast. And maybe also stretch it out. And obviously that's way too intense. We could take the contrast down, and that's getting closer, but it's still too much. So what we can do is we can come over here and then just drop in a multiply node and a float. And now this is saying multiply this by 0.5 or even less. So this becomes like a mix slider. Now we can barely see it. We can bring it up, and now we're seeing a little bit of that texture. And I think that's about all we need. Okay, let's do this gold material here. Glossy, put it on the windup. Get active material. Take our diffuse down to black since it's a metal. And now I'm going to take our specular up to a goldish color. And I'm going to reload because this isn't working. There we go, that's pretty nice already. It's a bit brighter. So let's take the index up. That's looking pretty good. Let's duplicate this plastic again and then add it to the top. And this one's going to be a baby blue. And same thing with the eyes. But this is just going to be a white. Cool, and finally the fuse, which is going to be the most difficult part. Let's just drop in a new glossy material. Put it on the fuse. And then get active material. Now here, as I showed you before, my buddy Travis Davids has a bunch of really great textures, and under here is this ultimate tileable displacement map pack. And there's a bunch of stuff that would work really well for fabric and other kinds of rope. So I'm going to navigate to that pack, just drop in an image texture to the diffuse. And this one here looks like it could work great for rope. So let's just grab this height map, hit no. And then we'll put our render region over this spot. And it already looks like it's going to map pretty good. So let's just come down to displacement, add displacement. And then I don't actually want this in the diffuse. Let's pop it into the displacement. And this is clearly way too much displacement. So let's take it down to 1, or even, let's try 0.25. That's pretty good right there. We can bump up the resolution. It's a little bit nicer. And then we don't really want this glossy, so let's crank up the roughness. And actually I found a better one in lines here. So if we look, there's one called 99 lines rope height. So let's use that. And this is looking a lot more natural. If we want, we could also rotate it on Z, just so that it's at a different angle here. So maybe that looks a little bit more like rope. Okay, and the final thing is colorizing this so that the end of the fuse is darker. So let's just grab a gradient here. pop it into the diffuse, and then crunch these down. And then let's set it to a linear gradient. Bring this out. And that's getting close. Let's rotate it on Z. There we go, and let's transform it. And that ought to do it. So there's our cute little dude there. All right, next I'm feeling pizza. Let's create another glossy material for the plate. Just drop that on there. And to see what's going on, let's go get active material and take this down to a much darker color. Super shiny. I say we add in a few little scratches, so let's just jump in the bump and find our scratch map from before. Let's solo this. That's mapping pretty nicely already, though we're definitely going to need to take it down so that the bump is not so extreme. And that should be pretty good. Let's maybe have fun though and give this a more interesting color. So something like this could be nice, and you're still picking up a little bit of these scratches. All right, moving on to this pizza. This is never going to look photorealistic unless we put a lot of texture work into it, and even then the shape is totally wrong. So let's just go for some element of reality in the texture, but allow it to stay in that stylistic realm. First, let's do the cheese. Let's drop in a glossy material, and then I'll right click and select object. Put this on the cheese. Right off the bat, I know I want this to be a subsurface scattering material because any kind of food is going to be better with subsurface scattering. So let's go down to specular, boost the roughness, and we could take the index up to like 1.5 to make it a little bit shinier. And let's come down to medium and do a scattering medium. Let's take the density down a fair amount. And then let's get RGB spectrums for the absorption and the scattering. Let's make sure the scattering's all the way up to white. And here's where we want to pipe in most of our color is in the absorption. So let's get this cheesy color. And you can see we're losing a lot of light, so let's go back and do that same old trick of going to common and turning on fake shadows. And that's going to allow a lot more light to penetrate. Now back to the roughness. I think we should actually bring this back down so it's a bit more of a shiny cheese. And this actually would benefit from some imperfections. So let's pop a render region here and then do the old image texture into the roughness. And because I'm lazy, let's do the same fingerprints thing. Now let's solo this. And again, specular material. Solo doesn't work, sadly. Come over to diffuse. Transform this down. Something like that. And I definitely do want a gradient here. Solo this. Crunch it on down. Disable. Move it back to a specular. And now you can see there's a little bit of that nice surface breakup. Now if it's looking too grungy and weird, we could always take this down a little bit. But I kind of liked it where it was. Now the final thing we can do to brighten this up is very similar to what we did with our statue. So we come back to basic and then we can convert this to a universal material. And of course we need to drop down the metallic. And now we can mix in some albedo. If it's at black, we'll be where we were before. But as we bring this up towards white, we'll be brightening this whole thing up. Tasty, tasty cheese. So let's just duplicate this material and then drop it on the pepperonis, as well as the sauce. And this one we're obviously just going to change the RGB spectrum to red. And maybe a bit more saturation. And also this one might not need the same treatment with the albedo, so let's take this back down. Or we could actually color the albedo a little bit red as well. Not that much. And we could also see if maybe the density needs to come up. That's definitely helping it feel a lot nicer. Now this cheese still isn't quite there for me, so let's right click and select the material. And maybe our albedo could go a little bit orange or yellow. That's definitely helping. And then in our absorption, maybe this comes up a little bit towards white and a little less saturated. More towards yellow. And a little bit more on the albedo is helping it brighten to a much nicer, cheesier look. And finally the bread, let's just duplicate this guy here and apply it to the crust. But this one we definitely want a lot more density. And let's remove any of this color cast. Same thing with the albedo. Maybe let's try to give the bread a bit of texture, so let's just duplicate this here and just for fun pop this into the albedo as well. And that's actually making a pretty big difference here. Maybe it's a bit too dark, so we could boost the gamma. Or actually, rather than that, let's just throw in a gradient and bring this up to a gray. There we go, so now it feels more like a breadstick. So as far as funky weird pizza goes, I think that's doing pretty good. Alright, next let's do this shuriken. I'm going to drop in a glossy material like you do. Drop that on this guy. Take the diffuse down to black. And then I'll boost the index up. Now, one way we can make this a little more interesting is we could come over to film layer here and kind of boost this up. And this creates a very multicolored surface. There's also the film IOR, and the higher you bring this up, actually, the more subtle this effect gets. When it's much lower, we get a much crazier variety of colors. And these colors will change dramatically depending on the angle of view. Now, if that's too crazy, which I think it might be, we could do something a little more subtle, and we can come over here to our fall off node and drop this in the specular. Now let's right click and solo this to see what it's doing, and we'll just play with the skew factor here. So you can see this is a Fresnel effect, and we've used this before, but if we add a gradient after this and solo this, we can crunch it down so that it's really just on the edges. Or we could invert these to have it be just on the outside edges here. So let's disable this, and instead of white to black, we could change this black to a blue color. So now we're just tinting the edges of the specular blue, and this is also dependent on the angle of view of the camera. So if we're facing down on it, we're going to see this a lot less than if we're at an angle of incidence. And then all of it's going to kind of turn blue. So we can maybe make this a little bit more subtle. And when I solo this, this might be a bit too flat, so we could pull these away from each other again. We could see what this looks like. So now we've got blue down here. Though I don't like that quite as much because from this high angle, everything's blue. So let's swap these two again. This is a bit nicer to me. Cool, I think I'm good on this. Next, let's just quickly add some black plastic to these guys here. So we could probably just drag this same black plastic on as before, because this already has some surface imperfections. Same thing for this monitor. Let's solo this. We could probably scale this down. Keep in mind though, because I'm sharing this texture, this is going to affect the wheels of the chair, but that's fine. Nobody's going to see those anyway. So I'm definitely liking this little breakup here that I'm catching, and it's looking a lot nicer. I think we could increase the index of refraction a little bit though. Plastics tend to be around 1.5, maybe 1.6. And here on this computer screen, we could make these buttons emissive. So I'll just navigate to our TV and then make a new diffuse material. Drop that on the buttons. Looks like I've selected the buttons for the remote, but that's not a problem either. So let's just grab all the buttons. And the other ones we want are here on the TV for light 1 and light 2. So let's just make this a green emissive material. emission, black body emission, bring this down. And here I'm going to use another node that you haven't seen, which is a Gaussian spectrum. I'll put this into the distribution. It doesn't really make a difference that much if I put it in the texture distribution here. And here the width is kind of like the saturation. So the lower this goes, the more saturated it gets, though we'll have to compensate with a little bit more power. And then the wavelength is the color. So let's kind of shift over to a green here, and now we can come down on the power. Just this is fine. Oh, and actually this is the joystick here. So we don't actually want those buttons to be like that. So let's get rid of those. And here we could just pop our red plastic onto these buttons. And that's looking kind of nice, but there's actually too much subsurface scattering. So let's just duplicate this texture here and get our active material and disconnect the subsurface scattering. And let's replace these two here. And we also don't want any transmission, so let's bring this down to black so that this is no longer a glass material. And then our albedo can come up to a bright red. Maybe a little too saturated. Actually, maybe more saturated and less bright. It's pretty close. I'm liking that. Let's look at our surface imperfections. That's fine. And this asset's looking pretty good.
All right, let's go for this cup next. Zoom in here a little bit. And I'm just going to start by dropping in a specular material. And let's just drop this on the cup. So it's looking a little bit too much like thick glass. So let's come in here and go to our node editor. And then let's go to the index and just take this down to maybe 1.04. That's actually looking a little too thin, so let's bring it back up. So that's a little bit closer. One thing that can really help here to make it feel more like plastic would be a little bit of subsurface scattering. So let's go to our medium tab and then hit scattering. And I'm going to start by taking the density way down. And then we'll just put an RGB spectrum in the absorption. And I'm going to put a float texture in the scattering. So for the scattering, I just want the float to be 1. And for this absorption, we could maybe tint it a certain color, like maybe we do a purple. And rather than applying this to the whole cup, I'm just going to apply it to the lid. And that actually makes a really big difference in the look. And to me, this feels a lot more plasticky now. We could also apply the same texture to the straw. Let's just duplicate that out. And maybe let's come around so we can see the whole straw a little bit better. And we'll pop in a render region. Let's do our same old surface imperfections, but you guys have seen this a million times, so I'll do it quick. Just grabbing whatever kind of roughness map I find first. Gradient. Crunch it down. Solo. Switch it to diffuse. That looks like it'll work. Back to specular. Disable. Cool, I think that's good enough. But the straw looks a little bit too thick still. So let's duplicate our texture. And then replace the straw. Come over to our node editor, get active material. Let's go to our index and maybe take this down even further. 1.05 maybe? If we undo, I'll just show you what that's doing. Let's store this. And I also don't think that the straw needs any subsurface scattering, so let's lose this and then take the index down again. So that's subtle, but it's not bending the light as much, so it feels a lot thinner. We could see what this looks like at an even lower index, just to see when we've pushed it too far. And actually I like that, though this texture here is definitely too grungy, so let's take this gradient down to a dark gray. And we could probably do the same thing over here, because the lid doesn't need a ton of grunge either. That's just gross. Just a little something. So that looks a lot better to me. And now for the rest of the cup. If we duplicate this again, we could do this and have the whole thing be plastic, but I kind of like it when there's a contrast, so maybe we turn this back into a glossy texture. And then with the roughness, we don't want this to be really that shiny, so let's bring this up. And if we wanted to, we could pretend that this is a paper cup. Not that there's a lot of paper cups with plastic dome lids, but I think it would give it some more interesting texture. So let's just grab an image texture here, put it in the diffuse. And there's a couple nice paper textures here on CCO textures. So I'll just grab this one. All right, let's grab the color. And let's solo that. That looks like it's mapping really nicely. So no need to change that. And that means that the normal map's gonna work just fine as it is too. And that's a subtle difference, but I think it just has a slightly more tangible feel. Cool, moving on. Let's just do our rubber ducky here. And really, this is just going to be a repeat of the textures we've done before. So let's grab one of these subsurface scattering textures and duplicate it, and then toss it on there. I'm going to hit Alt-S for scroll to first active, and then let's come up here and just drop this on the body. So I think this could be a lot more dense. Let's bring this up. And then I also feel like it should be less shiny. So let's take this up here. All right, so that's pretty good for the body. I think it's looking a little dull because there's no light on it right now. So we could just drop in an area light here. And I'm gonna cut this, and then I'm gonna paste it underneath the duck, and then drop it under the body, and reset PSR. So let's bring this back, and we'll take it back out of the hierarchy here because it's where we want. And now we could probably reset these coordinates and rotate it around 180. And scale it down, make it invisible, bring it forward a little bit, and then squish it. So we're probably not going to be looking at this from such a close vantage point, so let's back up and see what it would look like from afar. And this light is obviously just blasting, so let's bring it down. And if we just want to highlight some of these objects and not blast the desk, what we could do is we could set this light pass to something like 3, and then come over to our desk, and then drop on an Octane object tag. And then we'll enable our light pass mask, and then we'll untick 3. So now we're really bringing attention to some of these objects and not blasting the desk. Let's duplicate this material here, and we'll come back to our rubber ducky here, and we'll put this on the bill. And then we can just color shift it. Let's get active material. Let's make this more of an orange. And let's zoom back in. We could also make it so the duck isn't actually intersecting with the desk quite as much. Not looking too great. So let's rotate it down a bit. And maybe forward. That feels a little bit better. And then again, in our albedo, we've got that already set up. Let's make this more orange. And this is kind of nice, but it's still feeling a little bit too skin-like. So let's boost the density of this even more. That's getting better. Let's see what happens if we go pretty high. Let's go to like 1,000. That could be cool. Let's add even more into the albedo in terms of saturation and brightness. And then same for the absorption. That's much better. And then let's come back to this material here. I think we could do the same for the absorption here too. And the density. Let's take this up to at least 300. Because plastic does have some subsurface scattering, but not as much as like food or the cheese that we were making earlier. We don't want this duck to be made out of cheese. And then finally, let's just do one for the eyes. No color needed on this. And that should be good for the duck. If we really wanted to light this up a bit more, we could drag another one of these guys out and rotate it around and make this a bit more of a fill light. Maybe from the top. So we could just point it down a little bit. And kind of scoot it back so it's covering more of our duck's surface here. And maybe we play with this being a warmer light. And I still think this duck could be a little bit more rough and less grungy. So let's select this material and let's just bring this up closer to white and really spread that highlight out. So when I Google rubber duckies, we're pretty close, though maybe the eyes should be black and the body should be a bit more yellow. And for this, we can just take the absorption down to black. And that's definitely looking a lot better. I'm not sure if it's perfect, but I think I'm happy enough with it to move on. Cool, so next let's just come over here and we can really quickly texture this remote. So we've already got this black plastic. Let's just drop that on there. And then I'm going to come to this object here, twirl it open, and I'll put this on the body and all the buttons except for some of these circle buttons. And maybe I'll drop it onto this circle button 3 as well. And then we can duplicate this glowy material we already had for the other TV button and drop that on here. And then reduce the power. And then let's just duplicate this, put it onto button 2, and maybe this one's red. So we'll just swing the wavelength of the Gaussian spectrum over. And boost the power. So pretty basic, but I think that works just fine. Now let's move over to these blocks. We're going to do something different here. So I've got it set up here where there's one main block and the rest are instances. And I've done this on purpose. So to create an instance, if you don't know, you just come over to this menu here and you come down to instance. And the nice thing with instances, if we look here, and I'll just click this until we get this readout, is that they don't cause any additional usage of VRAM. So if I untick all of these, we're at 4.481 gigabytes, and if I turn them all back on, we're still at the same number of gigabytes. But one other caveat here, if we look at all of these, you can see that the instance mode is set to render instance versus instance. By default, the instances are set to instance mode instance. And you can see that's caused a slight increase of our VRAM. It's gone from 4.481 to 4.482. So obviously that's not a big deal. But when you've got massive scenes and you're cloning high poly objects like buildings, this can be a lifesaver. So make sure that your instances are set to render instance if you want to preserve VRAM. So I'll get rid of this extra instance here. And I'm going to create a new wood texture for this block so it's not the same as the desk. And in CCO textures, I found this wood 29, which I like, so I'm going to download the 8K version. Cool, so let's start by creating a new glossy material like usual. And we'll put this on all the different instances. And we can put it on this block in the background too. So let's open up our node editor here. And I'll drop my image texture into the diffuse. There we go. And same deal with the roughness. And let's grab the normal map. And let's transform these around. I'm going to unlock aspect ratio because this knot here looks stretched to me. So I'll scale that down on X a little bit. And then let's solo this so we can see what's going on. And now if we don't like the way that the UV map is working, like here it's stretched out really weirdly, we can switch the projection type. And I'll plug this into all 3. We can switch this to box. And now we're going to have to scale this down again. But there we go, that's already mapping a lot more cleanly. Maybe we could shift it over so there's a little bit more variation here. And try and get some of our knot holes in here, but not too many. And maybe a little bit further over. And this is obviously too repetitious, so let's scale this up a bit. And the tricky thing here is even if I rotate these 180, it's still got the same pattern on the other side. So it's kind of tough to get this to not look repetitive without splitting out the texture a bunch of times and offsetting each one individually. So we'll get to that a little later, but first I want to build the rest of the material. Just so it's not so crazy looking, let's scoot this over until we see fewer of these knots. Maybe just one there is good. Now let's unsolo and back our camera up a little bit. Now here I want to create some random variation in the color so each block doesn't look the same. And we can do that easily because these are instances. So that's another reason why I set this up. So let's scoot this over a little bit. And if we scroll down here, we can find this random color node. And let's just plug this into the diffuse for starters. So immediately we'll see that we've got different values from black to white that are totally random for each block. And again, if these were set to instance, this wouldn't work. So Octane only plays with this stuff in render instance mode, but it works great for cloners, it works great for scattering objects with Octane Scatter, which you can learn a ton about from my digital nature tutorials. So now that we've got this, how do we use it? Well, we can create a different shade of this diffuse with a color correction. So let's basically duplicate this up, use the same transform, except in this one we'll have a color correction that brightens the blocks. So let's put this into the texture, and let's swap this for the diffuse. And let's just take our gamma this way. So now we can have values between this darker wood and this brighter wood. And to make that happen, all we need is the mix node, which you guys have seen before. So we'll put this brighter version as texture 1, and this darker one as texture 2, and then we'll pipe this into the diffuse. Now for the amount, if you remember, it's a slider between 0 and 1. So 0 being texture 1, which is our brighter pathway, and 1 being texture 2, which is our darker pathway. But now if we use the random color to modulate the amount, we'll get immediate variation between all of those. And if we wanted to, we could drop a gradient between these two, and we could make the differences a little more extreme. So now we've made it so there's only really dark blocks and light blocks and fewer in between. The further we crunch this together, the more extreme that'll be. But I think we do want more subtle variation here. And I think we've pushed these brighter blocks a little too far. Like all of this is getting fairly washed out. So let's take our gamma back on this a little bit. So I think that's a little bit nicer and a little more subtle, but I still don't like how this is getting washed out. So I'm going to crunch this a little bit more. And actually, the more I'm crunching this, the more I'm realizing we're pushing these towards the lighter version. So actually, I want most of the blocks to be a bit darker. So if we flip these, then we'll get mostly dark blocks and a few lighter. And I've also realized this texture projection never went into this new texture either. So that's going to help a little bit. And now I really would like this block to be a bit darker. So what I can do is come to the random color and just change the seed. And there we go. Now this one's dark, and then we've got some light ones in there too. Now, if we want to see a knot on another one of these here, what we can do is just duplicate this and replace the texture in a couple other instances. Then come over here and transform this around. And actually, the reason that's not going to work is because these instances are reading everything about the source geometry, including the texture. So maybe what would make this better is we duplicate the source geometry here, and we take a few of these guys and instance this one instead. And that's swap the random values, but that's okay because we can change the seed in a bit. So with this new texture, let's drag it onto the new source geometry. And now we can come in and actually modify the transform. So let's solo this actually. And now you can see we're just affecting a few of these guys at once. And maybe let's scale it up. And to art direct this so we're not getting the exact same pattern, let's take one of these legs and tell it to be this source instead. And same thing with this block here. So let's disable this solo. And it looks like it's not updating, so let's fire the render off again. There we go, that's better. So let's solo this again. And with the transform, I think I want to squish this a little bit so it's not quite as oval shaped. And then we can just transform this down or over. So that's pretty cool. Now we're missing out on that randomness, so let's come back to our other texture here and start playing with the seed. And then also with this gradient, let's expand this a bit. So I definitely like this look better than what we had. And maybe it's not super necessary for small groups of objects like this to do this random color thing. Like we could have pretty easily just dropped on a few different versions of this wood and art directed it more manually. But when you have a ton of objects, this starts to really matter and can be a total lifesaver. So this desk scene is definitely starting to come together. It might be fun to pop on some shallow depth of field at this point. So let's come over to the thin lens and go to our depth of field. And I'm going to do my usual aspect ratio of 2 and aperture edge of 3 because I like that anamorphic bokeh look. And I'll untick autofocus and then just bring up the aperture a bit. And let's focus pick on something like this. And we can kind of get in here. Maybe you want to focus on the shuriken in the foreground. And to get this out of the way, you want to untick the focus picker and then click on the image. And this is maybe a little too much shallow depth of field, so let's bring the aperture down a little bit. This desktop scene is definitely starting to feel pretty nice. All right, there's just a couple more things I want to texture. First off, let's do this lamp. I'm going to grab a metal texture here. There's some pretty cool metal textures on CCO textures. Maybe some dented copper like this would be really cool. So let's download the JPEG here. Drop in a new glossy material, get our object, put this on the base, and the lower arm, and all the arms. And we can probably put this on pretty much everything except for the bulb. All right, no mysteries here. Let's grab the color. And then let's grab the roughness. And the normal map. And then let's transform them all down. I'll solo this. And we'll scale it down. That should be cool. And now this isn't looking anything like metal because our index is super low. So let's bring that up. Definitely more metallic there. Now if you remember, true metals don't have a diffuse component. So let's see what happens if we take this down to black. That's definitely looking more metallic, but now we've lost that color. So maybe we could use this color in the specular channel. And it's probably too saturated, so let's come down to our color correction here and desaturate. And if we want it to be a bit brighter, we could try a 1.5 brightness or messing with the gamma. Actually, let's take our gamma back because that's kind of stripped all the color away. Maybe if we saturate first and then play with the gamma. This is nice because it's got a little bit of a bronze color, but it's not super overwhelming. So in these wider shots, all this stuff is definitely coming together. If we want, we could play with some more lighting by just taking one of these lights back here and duplicating them over. Let's scale this down. Way down. And again, we could just set this to light pass 3 if we don't want it affecting the desk. And it's a little bit hot. And while maybe this isn't super realistic because it's not hitting the desk, but it is hitting these blocks, it's kind of fun to highlight the objects on the desk and create some more dramatic lighting this way. And we could pretend this is some moonlight coming in from this window, though honestly it's still a little bit too bright. Maybe just something subtle like this. And one thing we forgot to do is texture this part of the chair. So let's jump in here and do like a white leather. Maybe let's swing around to the front here so we can see it better. And again, CCO textures to the rescue. That could work. That could also work. Though I really like the texture of this, and we could just lose the color. So let's grab that. All right, same deal as usual. Select this material. Maybe we get away with just doing a normal map. Let's solo this. Obviously way too big. Transform this down. And let's drop a render region so we can see this a little bit faster. We could also drop a light in so we see the texture a bit better. So let's just duplicate one of these lights from up here. And let's boost the power a bit. And this is taking a really long time to clean up, so let's give this light more samples. Let's take it up to 11. There we go. Now the power is too strong. And I just realized the main reason this isn't showing up is because we're still on a diffuse material here. So let's switch this to glossy. And there we go. That's looking a lot more like what I would expect. Let's maybe elongate this light here and then back it way down. It's actually feeling a little bit unnatural to me, so I'm going to delete it. But now we can come back around to where we were before. And now we're going to definitely pick up that nice leather texture here, though it is a bit too shiny, so let's just boost the roughness. Let's see what happens if we use the roughness map from the actual texture. So that's maybe creating some nicer variation. Let's also try putting in the color map just to see what happens. So if we edit this, you can see this has some variation, so that's nice. And maybe we just invert this. And that way we're creating a bit more variation in the color channel. Though let's just check to see if we've made that much of a difference. Let's go to compare and store render buffer. And then let's disconnect the diffuse and the roughness. And honestly, it's pretty similar. The color map's not really adding anything, so we can definitely lose that. But I do like what happens here with the roughness map because we get some areas that are more shiny and other areas that are more rough. So let's put that back in. And then maybe let's play with scaling this whole thing down a little bit more. Maybe too far. Let's take it to 0.2. I think that's a bit better. If we want to go crazy, we could boost the normal map by typing in 2 here. So now we're really enhancing that bump, but I think that's a bit too much. So I'm going to take it back to 1. I think I'm happy with where this is. This is kind of a nice angle here, and these lights we placed over here are definitely blasting this, but it's also showing off some of the nice details on the desk and the plate, as well as this leather. One way we could make this a bit nicer is just by boosting the highlight compression. And you can see this is super blown out, but then when we bring this down, we're starting to get a much nicer roll off to the highlights. And we could even exposure down a little bit, and also gamma down. And now we've got more of a moody nighttime desktop going on. We can also play with longer lens looks. So this is a 76mm lens, and this is just compressing everything pretty nicely. Obviously this isn't textured, but we can just grab this same metal and drop it on. Or maybe this one's more of that shiny metal from earlier. Or maybe it looks better if we just shut it off and let this be negative space. And you can see from this angle we're also really getting that screen grunge going on. So that's definitely showing up nicely. And here with such a long lens, some shallow depth of field might be nice. Just a little bit goes a long way, and then we could focus pick on something like this guy here. So this is nice and subtle, where this is a little out of focus, and maybe this edge here is a little out of focus, but all these central objects here are pretty in focus. So the depth of field doesn't necessarily smack you in the face, but it's definitely there and contributing. If we wanted to make this more extreme, we just bring this up a bit, and now it should be really obvious where our focus point is. Though we could also make the training the focus of this scene. Here's another angle. Let's boost this neon. So it's glowing white hot. Maybe we feature it a bit more. And if you see it doing this where only a couple letters are highlighting, it could be an issue with surface brightness. So surface brightness can make it more uniform. See, we're not having that issue anymore. And just look at all those beautiful smudge marks. And now we're really picking up all this texture detail on the wallpaper too, and the raindrops in the window look pretty sweet. One thing that could further enhance this, by the way, if we select this material, and I know this is our most gigantic and overwhelming material that we've made, but it's a pretty easy addition. If we solo this, we could use this whole mask here as a bump map. So let's disable this. All we'd have to do is come over here and grab this node and pull it all the way over to our bump in both of these materials. And now we can see how that's changed things. So we can really see these details bumping up. And honestly, now it feels more like this gray paint is the top layer because these are bumping up. So to fix that, maybe we invert. So let's come down here and grab an invert node and just drop that on both of these. And now it's got more the feeling that it's dented inwards, and we're revealing back to the wood. Cool, so last but not least, let's navigate over here to our little car. And I'll pick focus on it. So let's talk about the basics of creating a car shader. I'm going to drop down a bit and get even closer. And for now, to make this easier to see, I'm just going to remove the shallow depth of field. Okay, and we can just drop a red plastic material on our mouse right here. So I'll just put this on him, and I'll change the diffuse. And I'll actually put this here and only place it on the body. And let's not worry too much about the tires here. We could probably just drop another plastic or rubber-like material on there. So let's just duplicate this out and grab the tires. So I'll just drop this on the tires here. And then let's duplicate out this metal and drop this on these silver pieces here. So that'll just be the rims. And we could reuse this red plastic for the brake discs. And for the windshield, obviously just a specular material. Let's select this object and drop it right there. And here we can also grab this outer glass for the headlights and pop this same material on there. If we turn this off, we can also access this light underneath it. Let's zoom in. So this is what should actually be emitting light. So let's right click and select this object. And then maybe just duplicate out our neon and drop it on there. And now let's turn the glass back on and zoom back out. And we can roughen the glass a little bit. Now the headlights are kind of graying out, so maybe we come to this neon and let's boost the black body emission a bunch. And let's put a render region down, because that's not really doing a whole lot. But if we come back to our glass and turn on fake shadows, that should help a little bit. And maybe we actually take out this RGB spectrum here. And we can take the headlights up to a bit more of a blue color. And then let's play around with adding a lot more power. But this starts looking more realistic when I really blast this light. And then add a bunch more samples here. Now we're starting to see something. So let's really take this sampling rate up. And that's looking a lot better. Maybe we can bring the power back down a little bit now. And if we look at car headlights, there's often these patterns in the glass that break things up. And the glass is not very rough. So let's change some things here. Let's go back to our glass and take the roughness back down. That's already looking a lot nicer. And then let's hit get active material. And then we could try something really simple here. Let's come down here to checker. And let's solo this. And then switch this back to diffuse. And put it into the diffuse slot. So that's obviously mapping really weirdly. So let's hit projection. And then change it to box. And then also UV transform. And scale it way up. Actually, we scale it down. I'm getting slightly better results with cylindrical, so let's transform this down. And then when we rotate on the X here, this is getting a lot closer. So let's just scale this down some more till it's something like that. And then let's use this in the bump channel. And I'll switch this back to specular. And unsolo. Okay, I'm not really seeing this show up very much yet, so let's zoom in a bit. So now we're starting to see it, and we could also just cheat and drop this into the normal map slot. And this isn't physically correct, it's not a normal map at all, but it's actually producing a more obvious result, so I don't really care. Let's stretch this pattern out so it's more like lines than individual boxes. So back to diffuse, solo, transform, unlock this. Okay, it's not the Y. Let's stretch it out on the X. Okay, this works weirdly when I stretch it out on the X and the Z together. So that's looking more like what I want. And then maybe we stretch it out on the Y a little bit too. All right, let's switch this back to specular. And it's maybe a little bit weird, but I think this could work okay. And actually, let's take this and squish it down even more so that there are these really thin lines. And then let's disable solo, come back to specular. So that's a lot closer to what I'm looking for, but we could mix this down with a multiply. And then a float. And let's see how far we want to take this down. I think right about there looks pretty good to me. And if we wanted to go all out, we could even texture the inner elements of this headlight, as in this chrome here. So say we just drop this on the chrome. Now we're seeing some chrome in there. Let's turn off this glass, and then also the black body emission. And select this object here. Just do the same chrome for this. And same for this. And this guy back here. And even this little housing for the light. And this little object here. Alright, so let's turn our glass and our black body emission back on. And that's a much nicer look. Alright, let's pop back out here. And now our headlight's looking pretty sweet. The only issue is this glass here is the same as the one here, and we've now got those lines in this material. So let's just replace this with a clean glass material. Select this object and drop this on here, and that's looking better. We could go back in here and turn on fake shadows, and that's brightened that up a bit. Alright, finally let's get into making our car paint shader. And let's try out a composite material for starters. So let's drop one of those in there. Let's find the body of our car here. There we go. And we'll drop that onto the body. Come into our node editor. And let's create two materials. We only need two. Add material. Add material. And this first one's going to be our main paint color, and this one's going to be our clear coat. So just right off the bat, we can just set this to a metallic material. And then let's put a float in here to see what's going on into material to mask. Now it's actually blending. So if we're at 0, we're in this world, and at 1, we're in this world. Now we want to apply this to the rest of the body, so let's duplicate this down and find these other parts here. Might be much easier if we just search for body. Though this looks like it's a different object entirely. And then if we right click and select this, all these carbon materials need to be textured too. So let's just select all these and apply this. And then delete these two extras. Getting closer, I also want this. And this is supposed to be glass here, but because of the Boolean object from the deadmau5 character, it's just kind of ridiculous. So let's just turn it off. And let's temporarily shut off the windshield, so we can easily access these objects. And right now this interior piece, we can just set to a black plastic. Same goes with the dashboard. And that's tiling too much, so let's scale it up. And just to make sure we're not affecting other materials, I don't remember if I duplicated this. So what we can do is come to this material and then go to assign, and it looks like we're good. We've only assigned this plastic to parts of this car. So let's come back here and disable solo, and that should all be fine for right now. Now let's turn our windshield back on, and then let's come back to our materials and back to our composite material here. And then let's push our mix slider all the way back to our car paint. Alright, so in our car paint, let's change the type away from diffuse to glossy. And already that's looking a lot nicer. Now I'm going to go for a somewhat metallic paint, so I'm going to shift the index of refraction all the way up to something like 5. And for this base coat of paint, I don't want it to be so shiny. That's what the clear coat's for. So let's take our roughness up to something like 0.2. Cool, that's looking good, so let's choose a color now. Let's just drop an RGB spectrum into the diffuse, and let's go for a cyan color. Maybe not that green. Let's push it this way a bit. Cool, I'm into that. We can also use the same color in the specular, and that'll tint the highlights cyan as well. Though maybe we don't want it to be quite as saturated in the specular, so let's do that in a bit. The next thing I want to do is create a little bit of color variation here, so we can just drop in a noise into the diffuse and replace that temporarily. And let's boost the contrast so we can see what's going on. And let's hit UV transform and projection. And clean this up. Now obviously the UVs on this car are pretty terrible, so let's swap this projection type for box. And that's looking a lot more even. Let's bring this transform down, maybe even a little bit further. So something like that scale could work. And if we wanted to, we could create more of a complex noise with big features and little features, but right now I'm just going to go for this more simple noise. Let's take the contrast back down. So that's a lot more subtle. And then we can remap these values with a gradient. So let's copy over our blue from here. We can right click and just copy, and then come over here and double click and right click and paste. And then let's just hold down Control to duplicate this knot. And maybe we'll make this a little desaturated and a bit darker. And we could even shift it more towards blue. And let's grab a render region so we can see better what's going on with the paint. So that's introduced a bit of variation. But our original shader here probably looked nicer and brighter. But what we can do is we can just mix these two together. So here's a mix. Let's go texture 1 and texture 2 and put this in the diffuse. And then let's change the mix to be biased more towards our original color. And now let's tweak these colors so that it's a bit more obvious. Maybe we make this one brighter. And this one a lot darker. And more saturated. And the other thing we can do is we can put this whole setup into the specular as well. So now I am seeing a bit of slight variation here. We could maybe bias it a bit more towards the noise. Though that's dulling down the paint, so let's maybe boost this up with a color correction. And we can just take the brightness to 1.5. And then replace this in the specular and in the diffuse. So now we're back to being brighter, and you can definitely see that variation. It's probably too much at this point, so let's bring it a little bit back. Somewhere around there could work pretty nice. So now the car has gotten really green again. And actually we could split out this color correction and put this into the specular here so that this one could be a bit desaturated. So this can control the saturation of our highlights. So at 0, these highlights will be white. And as we bring this up, we're going to be introducing more and more color. I think a little bit of color is nice, but not all the way up at 1. And here in both of these, we can also shift the hue a little bit more towards blue. So let's do half of that. So I think this is pretty close to what I was looking for. Let's just compare this to the original color. So let's go compare store, and then we can just replace this RGB spectrum in here and just bypass everything into the diffuse and then ditch the specular. And this is pretty close, though I am liking the saturation on this paint originally, so maybe we boost the saturation here. Let's replace these back. And in this color correction, we can boost the saturation a bit. Awesome, so I'm liking where that's at. Next, let's put in the secret sauce. And let's grab an image texture and put it into the normal. And here we want to search for flakes map. And there's a whole bunch of options here. These are normal maps that are designed to create car flakes in the paint. Now I've got one that I've been using for a while that looks like this. Basically the same deal, but it's also at a smaller scale, so I feel like there's less repetition in this one. So let's import that, and we're gonna have to solo this for sure, because again, the UVs are crazy. So let's change this to box. And that's kind of nice, though I think we're going to want to scale it down some more, but let's just take a look right now. And here you can definitely see what this is doing. It's causing all these little sparkles in the paint and the light to bounce at different angles, which creates this kind of glittery effect. This is the same kind of thing you could do with a snow shader to make that glittery look happen. So let's hit UV transform and let's scale this down quite a bit, maybe down to 0.2. And I think that's a bit more realistic on the scale. If we come around here, we can see what it's going to look like when the light's hitting it. And here we're definitely picking up a lot of these flakes, but overall our paint is still feeling too rough. So that's where this clear coat comes in. So if we swing this back to something like 0.5, we'll definitely start to see that we're picking up a lot of highlights, but then still keeping the flakes and the roughness underneath. Now the only thing is we want to limit this a little bit. So if we grab a fall off shader here and replace our float texture, and then solo this. Let's bring the skew factor up a little bit. Now we're going to see a lot more of the flakes and the rough paint here in these areas that are facing the camera, and then when we get closer to the angle of incidence, we're going to see a lot more of these intense reflections from the clear coat. So let's disable this solo, and there we go. This is looking a lot more realistic. We're still seeing those flakes, and we're seeing some nice reflections here too, but they're not as crazy metallic and overwhelming. One thing I'm noticing here is the glass is really distorting our dead mouse head. So let's select this and just bring down the index. And this is looking a lot more natural to me. Let's widen out our lens a bit so we can see the whole car. And maybe pan up a little bit and maybe scoot a little bit further back. And remember, if we wanted to increase this effect, we could add a gradient here and solo the gradient, and then crunch the whites and blacks together. So that's just going to change the contrast between where we're getting very intense reflections and less intense reflections. But I'm not sure that we need this, so let's delete it. I think that was just limiting this nice highlight a little bit too much. Now let me show you one more way we could have achieved this. Let's store this render buffer so we can always look back at it. And for now we're going to disconnect our fall off map here. And we're just going to take our float texture and put it back here. And we'll go back to just our car paint. And just to prevent confusion, let's just delete this texture here. We don't need the clear coat or the fall off map anymore. And let's pretend that we're not even using a composite material. Let's just say this is a universal material. And so now we're back to just that car paint look without the reflections. And basically we just need to add back in a clear coat. Now the universal material has a pretty sweet new tab here called coating layer. And so if we just drag this up, immediately we're going to see we get back our coating. And we can compare that to before. Pretty similar and maybe less hassle, though you don't have quite as much control here. You can also choose the coating roughness. So this is going to make these reflections a little bit blurry. I don't really want that. And we can also mess with the coating IOR. So this can get really bright and shiny, though at some point it really feels like we're losing the subtlety of the car paint and we're losing that Fresnel effect. Let's see how far we can go with the coating. Bringing it all the way to 1, we've got a lot more reflections all over the place, and really this is more of a matter of taste. I think this looks really good too. It's just more of a matter of whether you want a super shiny car versus more of a matte coat of paint. If we store this, and I'm going to hit undo to go back to where we were before, and I'll put 0.5 into the float, so we're doing a 50% blend with the clear coat. This is actually a very similar look, and we've pretty much lost all of that Fresnel effect. So that's a nice extra control that doing this blend material with fall off map gives you.
And finally, here's some more renders from my first attempt when I was just testing things out and figuring out what I was going to teach. Overall, I'd say these are really similar, though I think we improved on the car shader, and the only reason I used the Arnold training here is because that was the default screen for GSG+. Hopefully we'll see some Octane popping up here soon. Anyway, that about wraps it up. Congrats everyone, you made it through the 5-hour training, and at this point, I bet you'll have a much better handle on all the features in Octane, all the possibilities, and different workflows you can use to achieve the renders of your dreams. Don't forget that for further training, you can go to my site ariavisuals.com/tutorials, and for further training, you can go to my resources page, which has all the Octane tutorials in the known universe. And last but not least, don't hesitate to reach out to me with any further questions. I really enjoy answering questions and helping people out. So there are no stupid questions, just